When American Tier 1 operators first trained alongside British Special Forces, they expected to meet men who looked and acted like Hollywood action heroes. Instead, they met operators who wore no unit patches, carried zero ego, and possessed a level of endurance and fieldcraft precision that had no equivalent in the conventional military world. They weren't just the SAS, they were 14 intelligence company, and they made the IRA look like absolute amateurs. West Belfast, a grey Tuesday in the mid-1980s. A plain saloon car moves at ordinary residential speed down the Falls Road. The driver looks like a local, jacket, jeans, nothing remarkable. The passenger is reading a map, not because he's lost. Every address in this stretch of the city has been committed to memory, along with the daily routines of 11 individuals whose movements he's been tracking for 2 weeks. He's reading the map because his eyes need somewhere to point that isn't the third house from the corner where someone is about to do something that British intelligence needs to know about. Under the seats, inside panels that look identical to standard car trim, are Kevlar armor plates with firing gaps cut through them, allowing the occupants to shoot through the bodywork without opening a door. A foot switch on the floor connects to a flashbang dispenser mounted beneath the chassis, capable of throwing multiple stun grenades outward simultaneously, useful at a roadblock or when a crowd starts closing around the vehicle, or when the options narrow and one of them is fatal. The brake lights can be cut by a dashboard switch, so the car can make a night pickup without glowing red to every IRA watcher on the block. An engine cut-off switch handles anti-hijacking. Tamper detection runs through the wiring because a device planted overnight isn't a theoretical risk in this environment. 2 operators, 1 unremarkable saloon, no visible weapons, no backup closer than 20 minutes. Their only protection is that nobody on this street knows they exist. This is 14 Intelligence Company. The debt. This is what it looked like when it was working. By 1969, the British Army was in Northern Ireland in an ostensibly peacekeeping role between Catholic nationalist and Protestant unionist communities. By 1971, it was obvious that conventional uniformed presence would never be sufficient against an organisation that operated from inside the civilian population. The Provisional IRA had emerged as a structured guerrilla force with active service units, command structures, and intelligence of its own. You can't arrest someone whose movements you can't track. You can't intercept a weapons shipment you don't know is coming. Without close-in current intelligence, the British Army was perpetually reacting to events rather than preempting them. The first attempt to build that intelligence architecture was the Military Reaction Force, set up in August 1971. The MRF ran plainclothes surveillance from unmarked vehicles fitted with covert radio equipment, essentially the first iteration of the Q-car concept in Northern Ireland. It also attempted to recruit informers inside the Republican community. The concept was correct. The execution wasn't. Personnel were drawn from regular battalions with minimal specialist training. Oversight was thin. The unit was later linked by a BBC Panorama investigation to 10 shootings of unarmed civilians. The operational end came from a straightforward intelligence failure. IRA interrogations of 2 MRF double agents, Seamus Wright and Kevin McKee, unravelled a cover operation the unit was running out of a laundry facility on the Falls Road. An IRA ambush killed 1 MRF soldier. By 1973, the unit was finished. What replaced it wasn't an improved MRF. It was a different kind of organisation entirely. A dedicated formation of 22 SAS was given 2 simultaneous tasks. First, close the surveillance gap in Northern Ireland immediately. Operating in plain clothes as debadged operators, formally returned to their parent units, their SAS service deniable if they were killed. The Cabinet's concern was political. Deploying the SAS openly could be read as an admission that the IRA posed a military-grade threat rather than a criminal one. Second, design and run the selection and training pipeline for a permanent professional replacement. The unit formed by that process cycled through several cover designations: the Special Reconnaissance Unit, then Northern Ireland Training and Advisory Teams, then the Intelligence and Security Group. But by 1973, its three-detachment structure was operational. North Det covered Londonderry and the North West. East Det covered Belfast. Mid-Ulster Det covered the interior, South Armagh and County Tyrone, terrain that the IRA's rural brigades knew with an intimacy that made it among the most dangerous operating environments in Europe. By April 1974, the unit was taking casualties. That was how fast the transition from concept to operational reality moved. Formal command sat under a lieutenant colonel. The institutional parent was the British Army's Intelligence Corps, not the SAS, not MI5, not RUC Special Branch. The distinction mattered operationally. The DET's rules of engagement were specific: observe, report, and fire only in immediate self-defense. They fed intelligence up the chain to whoever needed it. The SAS for direct action operations, RUC Special Branch for arrests, MI5 for strategic analysis. They were the collection layer, not the shooters. In 1987, the unit was formally brought within the United Kingdom's Special Forces Directorate, acknowledging what had always been functionally true about its operational standard. Their emblem encoded their purpose. The insignia depicted a peacock bearing the name Argus, the hundred-eyed giant of Greek mythology, described as so perpetually watchful that only a few of his eyes slept at any time. In Sean Hartnett's memoir, Charlie 1, written about serving in the unit's later incarnations, the self-description is exact. The 100 eyes of the Argus is precisely what we are. The hidden eyes of British intelligence in Northern Ireland. We are the watchers. Watchers, not warriors. That distinction shaped everything about how the unit recruited, what it looked for, and what it put candidates through to find out if they were genuinely capable of it. Selection was open to every branch of the armed forces, and, uniquely for the era, to both men and women. 14 Intelligence Company was the first UK Special Forces unit to operationally integrate female operators in field roles. Not as a policy experiment, but because the operational requirement was unambiguous. Female operators could access surveillance positions and social environments that all male teams couldn't without immediate suspicion. Male and female pairs operating as apparent couples were standard practice in Republican neighbourhoods, where a lone man watching a doorway would be noticed and reported within the hour. From an initial pool of roughly 1,000 applicants, approximately 17 made it through the full pipeline to operational deployment in Northern Ireland. That ratio is the most compact description of what selection was designed to do. Initial screening combined physical tests, IQ assessment, and interview. Those who cleared it were invited to a 2-week residential selection course. Physical endurance was part of it, but not in the conventional sense. The emphasis was sustained cognitive function under conditions designed to degrade it. Sleep deprivation, schedules deliberately erratic enough to prevent the body from adapting, loaded marches immediately followed by intellectual tasks, memory exercises run under conditions of fatigue and stress. Candidates were required to memorize faces, vehicle registrations, and daily movement patterns, with the kind of retention precision the operational environment would later demand. Anyone with a tattoo, birthmark, or scar that couldn't be concealed was automatically excluded. Cover identity had to be total. A watchful person in Republican Belfast, and watchful people were everywhere, needed to find nothing worth remembering about the operators moving through their street. Those who passed selection entered a 6-month training pipeline. Advanced driving, sustained high-speed maneuvers, anti-ambush responses, using the vehicle as a weapon, controlled crashes, skid recovery. Covert photography, including infrared and night vision techniques, plus the ability to conceal cameras in clothing and car interiors, and film without a visible lens. Surveillance discipline at every level, maintaining observation posture in ditches, attics and parked vehicles for days, tracking targets on foot and by vehicle while operating covertly on a radio net, memorizing patterns without visibly observing anything. Lockpicking, key copying, and entry procedures for planting audio and video surveillance devices inside target locations and leaving without a trace. They also trained to fight, as a survival contingency, not a primary function. Browning high-power pistols with extended 20-round magazines. Compact Walther PPK sidearms, used particularly by female operators and as concealed backup weapons. HK MP5K submachine guns, HK-53 carbines, G3 assault rifles. Anti-ambush drills conducted from inside moving vehicles. A Remington 870 shotgun was carried in det cars, positioned to clear a windscreen in the event the situation escalated beyond what primary weapons could address quickly enough. James Rennie, a former det operations officer who published the first inside account in 1996 under a pseudonym, The Operators, on the streets with Britain's most secret service, described an organisation whose members bore false names, carried no personal identification, and operated without displaying internal ranks in the field. The formal hierarchy existed. A lieutenant colonel commanded the unit, but in a ditch in South Armagh at 2 a.m, watching an IRA weapons cache in the rain, rank was irrelevant. The operator with the greatest specific knowledge of that specific situation made that specific decision. Competence was the only currency that mattered. That cultural detail produced something concrete. An organization where the only measure was what you could actually do tended to develop exactly the qualities the environment demanded. Absolute psychological stability under sustained isolation and threat. The judgment to improvise under lethal pressure without waiting for authorization. And the complete absence of ego about recognition. Ego gets you noticed. In this environment, getting noticed had one outcome. The cue car deserves a precise accounting, because the specifics aren't decorative. From the outside, it was a completely ordinary domestic saloon. Standard civilian registration, nothing more conspicuous than a Ford Cortina or a Vauxhall Cavalier. Inside the bodywork, it was considerably different. Covert radios with hidden speakers and microphones, undetectable in a casual search. Video and still cameras concealed around the interior, positioned to capture footage through gaps without any visible lens. Controllable brake lights, operated by a dashboard switch, cut entirely for night operations so the car could stop and collect a colleague without advertising the pause to anyone watching. Engine cut-off switch as an anti-hijacking measure. Electronic tamper detection throughout the wiring, because a device planted overnight was a real and documented threat. Kevlar armor plating built into the body panels, with deliberate gaps for firing through the bodywork. And, in some configurations, a flashbang dispenser mounted beneath the chassis. Multiple stun grenades deployed simultaneously in all directions from a single foot switch activation. Each modification addressed a specific and documented threat. The IRA used car bombs, coordinated ambushes, hostile crowds, and checkpoint seizures as tactical tools. Every system in a Q car was a direct engineering answer to one of those methods. Above those vehicles, invisible from street level, the Army Air Corps operated what Det personnel called bat flight. Gazelle helicopters, equipped with forward-looking infrared cameras and video systems, slaved to missile targeting optics. From altitude, out of sight and sound, a Det operator in the aircraft tracked suspects through the FLIR, while Q-car teams coordinated below. The helicopter layer and the ground layer fed each other in real time. Neither of those layers was dramatic in operation. An op might run for 3 weeks before it produced anything actionable. Operators sat in parked cars, in rented flats secured under civilian cover documentation, in agricultural land, watching a farm building that might not be visited for another 10 days. Feeding observations through covert radio nets, building the intelligence picture fragment by fragment until it was complete enough to act on. Det operators lived from safe houses in or near their areas of operation. Full civilian cover, driving licenses, utility bills, rental agreements, everything that made the identity hold under scrutiny by people who were specifically looking for anomalies. In the most hostile Republican areas, that documentation had to withstand a determined effort to break it. Cover wasn't a convenience, it was the only protection. The psychological demand of that operating environment was cumulative in a way that short-burst physical selection can't simulate. Weeks in hostile territory, maintaining a false identity under ongoing threat of discovery, watching people who were actively trying to find you. What selection screened for were precisely the qualities that environment would eventually break in anyone who didn't genuinely possess them. That operator profile, expert, anonymous, self-reliant, without ego, wasn't invented in Northern Ireland. It traced to a specific British military culture, and that culture had a direct, documented impact on how America eventually built its own elite tier. In 1962, U.S. Army Special Forces officer Charlie Beckwith was posted as an exchange officer to 22 SAS. He commanded 3 Troop A Squadron, deploying to Malaya during what would prove to be the defining period of his career. When he came back to the States, Beckwith wrote a paper arguing that the U.S. Army needed a counter-terrorist unit modelled explicitly on the SAS. Not an adaptation of existing special forces, a structural redesign, beginning with how operators were selected. What he had seen in the SAS and found absent in American forces was specific. Selection conducted on the ground over time, testing judgment and endurance rather than peak physical performance at a given moment. Patrol commanders who operated with genuine discretion, making decisions without waiting for guidance. Self-reliance built into the command culture, not treated as a personal virtue. Beckwith later described his assessment of the British SAS selection process as producing better operators than US Army procedures, precisely because the selection happened on the ground, where what mattered actually mattered. It took 15 years for Beckwith's proposal to become reality. Delta Force was formally activated on November 19, 1977. Its organizational DNA was explicitly the SAS. That is documented, verified, and foundational. Now consider what that lineage means for the debt. 14 Intelligence Company was built by the SAS, not as a figure of speech, but as an organizational fact. A dedicated formation of 22 SAS designed and ran the debt's selection and training from the ground up. The same cultural standard that shaped Delta Force was the standard the debt was measured against from day one. The endurance, the self-reliance, the decentralized judgment, the absence of ego as a functional requirement of the job. These qualities appear in every description of what SAS selection produces, and they are precisely what a debt candidate had to demonstrate before reaching Northern Ireland. The unit that inspired Delta Force created the unit the IRA couldn't stop. Specific details of any joint training between American Tier 1 units and 14 Intelligence Company remain classified. What the open record confirms is that US-UK Special Forces exchanges ran consistently throughout this period. Multiple rotations annually, according to available accounts, with American operators moving through the British SOF ecosystem regularly. Mick Hawkes, one of the few operators known publicly to have served in both 22 SAS and 14 Intelligence Company, has spoken about his debt service conducting operations against the IRA and loyalist paramilitaries. The kind of crossover presence that shaped what American exchange officers encountered when they trained alongside British counterparts. The cultural gap between the two approaches was visible and documented on both sides. Research from the Royal United Services Institute describes the British Army's institutional culture as rewarding initiative, self-reliance, and the willingness to make independent decisions under uncertainty, in ways that contrasted directly with more centralized, doctrine-dependent command cultures. An American operator trained to escalate ambiguous decisions upward encountered British counterparts who treated lateral initiative at the lowest level as a baseline professional expectation. In a surveillance operation inside a hostile city, where calling for instructions would have broken cover and likely ended the mission and the operator, that difference wasn't theoretical, it was operational. What American operators encountered in those exchanges was a model sharpened by years of contact with actual enemies in actual terrain, with real consequences for every failure. One former soldier connected to the British Special Forces selection pipeline, someone who had personally known 9 men who passed SAS selection, put it plainly: intelligence, sustained endurance, and the absence of ego is a combination that's hard to beat. Applied to an operator sitting alone in an IRA neighborhood for weeks with minimal support and no visible backup, all 3 of those qualities were survival requirements, not aspirational traits. What that capability translated to in documented operational practice is where the argument moves from inference to evidence. May 8, 1987, County Armagh. The East Tyrone Brigade of the Provisional IRA had, by the mid-1980s, become the most aggressive active formation in the organisation. Under Brigade Commander Patrick Joseph Kelly, born in Carrickfergus in 1957, a veteran IRA member since the early 1970s, arrested in February 1982 on informant testimony, but released 18 months later after a trial that lasted 15 minutes. The brigade had developed a specific tactical method. They used stolen JCB diggers to breach the perimeter fences of isolated RUC stations, deploying large bombs in the front bucket. At Ballygawley in December 1985, they shot dead 2 police officers and wrecked the station. At the Birches in August 1986, the same method succeeded again. The brigade was doing this with apparent impunity. The attack planned for Loughgall on May 8th was intended as a carbon copy. 8 men, a stolen blue Toyota Hiace van, a stolen JCB loaded with 300 to 400 pounds of explosive inside an oil drum in the front bucket, wired to two 40-second fuses. The unit arrived from the northeast shortly after 1900, wearing bulletproof vests, boiler suits, gloves and balaclavas, armed with G3 and FNC rifles, a shotgun and a revolver. Declan Arthurs, 21 years old and a trained digger operator from Galbally, drove the JCB. Patrick Kelly rode in the Toyota's passenger seat. Jim Liner, one of the IRA's most experienced rural commanders, was in the rear. They had no idea the operation was compromised before it began. British security forces had intelligence about the planned attack weeks before it happened. The specific target had been identified at least 10 days prior. A covert observation post monitoring the stolen JCB at the Lislassley Road farm reported when the digger was moved. That report triggered the SAS taking up their positions. 6 SAS soldiers in plain clothes were already inside the station when the IRA unit arrived. 18 more in uniform were distributed across 5 concealed positions in the wooded areas surrounding the building. The station, normally staffed only 4 hours daily, had been quietly reinforced with 2 RUC HMSU officers placed inside for the operation. The IRA unit drove past the station twice at low speed before committing. Their own instincts apparently registered that something was wrong. They proceeded anyway. Arthurs drove the JCB into the perimeter fence. The fuses were lit. The bomb detonated. The SAS opened fire simultaneously from the building and from every external position. 600 spent British cartridge cases were recovered from the scene afterward. All 8 members of the East Tyrone Brigade were killed. Patrick Kelly, Jim Liner, Padraig McKerney, every senior operational figure in the brigade died in that village. 2 civilians, brothers Anthony and Oliver Hughes, were driving home in a white Citroën when they inadvertently entered the ambush zone behind the van. Anthony was killed. Oliver was shot 14 times and survived. The weapons recovered from the IRA dead were linked by the RUC to 7 murders and 12 attempted murders in mid-Ulster. Declassified Irish government documents released in 2017 revealed that ballistic testing connected those same weapons to 40 to 50 killings, including every IRA-caused fatality in counties Fermanagh and Tyrone in 1987, before the date of the ambush. The East Tyrone Brigade's most capable active service unit had walked into a pre-positioned trap, watched from the moment of preparation. 3 years later, October 9, 1990, County Armagh. Martin McCaughey, a Sinn Féin councillor, East Tyrone Brigade volunteer and boyhood friend of several of the Loughgall dead, approached a farm building in rural County Armagh with IRA volunteer Desi Grew. The building was being used as a weapons cache. Inside were 3 AK-47 rifles. 14 Intelligence Company had been monitoring those weapons and, according to the available account of the operation, was aware the 2 men were due to collect them. British security forces were in position when McCaughey and Grew arrived. Both were killed. The operational structure in both cases was identical. Surveillance identifying a specific weapons location, tracking who was coming for it, and positioning a lethal response before the IRA's active service unit knew the cache was compromised. The intelligence had been built in advance. The ambush was a consequence of that intelligence, not its starting point. The IRA eventually understood that they were being watched in ways they couldn't see. By the late 1980s, they had started training volunteers in basic counter-surveillance techniques, route sweeps, varying movement patterns, decoy vehicles, their own surveillance operations against British covert teams. The IRA's internal doctrine document, the Green Book, given to every volunteer, acknowledged the surveillance threat explicitly. Some DET operators were identified over time. Some operational covers were burned. None of it proved sufficient. The deeper reason goes to a detail that is itself a statement about the IRA's institutional capacity. Freddie Scappaticci, a Belfast bricklayer who had risen by 1980 to become a senior figure in the IRA's Internal Security Unit, the unit specifically tasked with finding and eliminating British informers inside the Republican movement, was reportedly himself a British Army Force Research Unit agent, codenamed Steak Knife. The man whose job was to prevent exactly what he was doing had been doing it for years. Operation Canova, the subsequent police investigation, confirmed that claims about Scappaticci's role were almost universally treated as true by those with direct access to the relevant intelligence. The IRA's counter-surveillance effort was reporting to British intelligence in something approaching real time. The organisation that was supposed to catch British penetrations was itself penetrated at its apex. Some watching the operational record of this period reached a blunt conclusion: that the IRA was simply outclassed at every level that ultimately mattered. The academic record requires qualification. The South Armagh Brigade remained a genuinely capable adversary well into the 1990s, and the IRA killed soldiers and operatives throughout the conflict. But the strategic verdict wasn't close. The intelligence architecture, the surveillance capability, and the human penetration that reached into the IRA's own counterintelligence structure together produced a strategic outcome that the IRA's tactical capacities couldn't reverse. There is one more dimension to this story, and it concerns the IRA's claim about what it fundamentally was. Throughout the conflict, the Provisional IRA maintained a consistent public position. They were soldiers, not criminals, engaged in a legitimate armed struggle. The language was deliberate. They used military ranks, volunteer, officer commanding, army council. They described operations as military actions. When the 1994 ceasefire came, the official IRA statement described it as a cessation of military operations, the exact vocabulary of an organized armed force acknowledging a change in strategic conditions. The framing wasn't merely rhetorical, it was a claim on legal status, specifically the protections afforded to prisoners of war. And for a period, the British government had implicitly recognised that claim. Following a 1972 hunger strike by IRA prisoners led by Billy McKee, the government granted what was called special category status. Prisoners with that designation could wear their own clothing, refuse prison work, freely associate with other inmates, and organise their own activities. These were, in practical terms, the basic conditions of prisoner of war treatment. The distinction between political prisoner and convicted criminal was maintained by concession. That ended on March 1, 1976. From that date, anyone convicted of a scheduled offence in Northern Ireland was an ordinary criminal. Prison clothing, prison work, full compliance with civilian penal discipline. The H-blocks at the Maze prison, purpose-built for the post-special category regime, received their first prisoners that year. The blanket protest started almost immediately, prisoners refusing to wear prison clothing, wrapping themselves in cell blankets. It escalated through the dirty protest and then, in 1981, into the hunger strikes. Bobby Sands was the first to refuse food. He had been in prison since 1977 on firearms charges. His strike began in March 1981. On April 9th, while still refusing food, he was elected Member of Parliament for Fermanagh and South Tyrone, a constituency election that briefly overshadowed the strike in the press, before his death overshadowed everything else. Bobby Sands died on May 5, 1981, on the 66th day of his hunger strike. 9 more men followed him into starvation and died over the next months. 10 deaths in total. Their 5 demands were specific: the right to wear their own clothing, exemption from prison work, free association, the right to organize educational and recreational activities, restoration of the remission lost during the years of protest. Stated plainly, they were asking for the return of political prisoner status, the practical equivalent of prisoner of war treatment. Margaret Thatcher refused, through all 10 deaths. Her position was stated without ambiguity and held without revision. There was no political status for terrorists. Crime is crime. The British state's entire framing of the Troubles depended on that insistence. IRA members were criminals, not combatants, and treating them as anything else would legitimize the campaign. Here is the part that requires attention. When IRA members were arrested on active service, caught during surveillance operations, intercepted moving weapons, detained immediately after attacks, their legal representation invariably invoked the full apparatus of civilian criminal procedure: right to silence, access to a solicitor before interview, challenges to evidence under domestic legislation, appeals through the UK court system to the European Court of Human Rights. Every mechanism of the liberal democracy they claimed to be at war with was deployed to contest prosecutions and seek acquittals. The same organisation that demanded soldier status and POW protections for its imprisoned members claimed civilian rights when its members were arrested. When it was useful to be soldiers, they were soldiers. When it was useful to be civilians, they invoked civilian protections. The choice of status was governed not by principle, but by which designation offered the greater immediate advantage. One observer watching this pattern over the course of the conflict described it with precision. The PIRA wanted to be treated as prisoners of war in custody, but claimed civilian rights when arrested on active service. The word hypocrisy is a judgment. The factual description beneath it's more precise. The IRA's claim to be an army was always a political claim, not a military one. It depended on never being tested by the genuine article. When 14 Intelligence Company built the intelligence picture that put 8 men of the East Tyrone Brigade in a pre-positioned ambush in May 1987, when surveillance units monitored an IRA arms cache and waited for the volunteers to arrive, when the organisation tasked with protecting the IRA from British penetration was reportedly itself reporting to British intelligence. These weren't the experiences of armies engaging as equals. They were the documented outcomes of a professional intelligence apparatus operating systematically against an organisation that couldn't match it at any level that ultimately mattered. The IRA claimed to fight a war. The record of what happened every time they crossed paths with 14 Intelligence Company suggests they were engaged in something considerably more modest. In 2005, 14 Intelligence Company was absorbed into the newly formed Special Reconnaissance Regiment. The SRR's remit was explicitly global, taking the DET's Tradecraft beyond Northern Ireland into Iraq, Afghanistan, and counter-terrorism operations worldwide. The academic study, From Northern Ireland to Afghanistan, British Military Intelligence Operations, makes the connection explicit. The methods developed in West Belfast and South Armagh became a transferable template for how Britain conducted covert surveillance in every subsequent conflict. The unit that was built to watch the IRA eventually became the institutional foundation for how Britain watches its enemies anywhere. James Rennie's 1996 memoir, The Operators, published under a pseudonym because that was the only way it could appear, remains one of the few inside accounts in existence. The unit had, by Rennie's own account, never been penetrated by the press. No unit patches at parades. No public ceremonies for successful operations. The Argus watched in silence, which was always what it was built to do. What that silence built was something more durable than recognition. The expert, anonymous, no-ego culture of 14 Intelligence Company proved so operationally effective that it became the template for how Britain approaches the hardest surveillance challenges in the world. 32 years,